Thank you for joining today's Fighting Hate from Home. At this time, I'm pleased to introduce ADL CEO and National Director, Jonathan Greenblatt.
Thank you, Sasha. Last Monday, ADL and Kroll and Mooring, LLP, filed a federal lawsuit against Iran, Syria, and North Korea for providing material support to the terror organization Hamas to commit atrocities in Israel on October the 7th that directly harmed scores of U.S. citizens and their families. This lawsuit was filed on behalf of more than 125 plaintiffs who are either a U.S. citizen or the family of a U.S. citizen who was harmed and impacted in the 10/7 massacre, the largest and most violent anti-Semitic act impacting the Jewish people since the Holocaust. The aim of this lawsuit is to seek financial compensation on behalf of those families under applicable federal and local laws. This was an attack on Israel, but in a way, it was also an attack on America. This lawsuit will show by clear and convincing evidence that the Islamic Republic of Iran, Syria, and North Korea provided material support to Hamas that enabled the terror group to commit the atrocities in southern Israel. A favorable ruling in this case will send a message to terrorists and their enablers worldwide that actions have consequences, and we will hold them accountable. In a world in which Jewish pain and suffering far too often is erased, in which Jewish victims and the community broadly is gaslit by those who deny the atrocities committed against us with predictable regularity, we hope this groundbreaking case will bring some measure of justice to these victims and create an undeniable record, proven in a court of law, of Hamas's heinous brutality that, again, was perpetrated with the support of the state sponsors of terror, Iran, North Korea, and Syria. We have put all our weight behind this case. And while we recognize that this is not a quick process, we unfortunately won't enjoy a speedy resolution. We will be relentless, and we will not let up until we have a favorable ruling. And we anticipate that happening here. Now, the substantial amount of media coverage of this announcement demonstrates just how important, just how consequential this case is. Since it was announced a week ago, it's been covered in major outlets like AP, CNN, NBC, CNBC, across the full gamut of Israeli and Jewish media. It's been picked up by press in Europe and South America. Iranian and Farsi language outlets have been covering this. They're consumed by Iranians in the diaspora and inside the country as well. Additionally, we saw unprecedented levels of engagement with social media influencers, generating more than 25 million impressions on X alone and far more on Instagram. This is happening because the world knows what happened on 10/7 was so horrific, and the world wants to ensure that the people who perpetrated these crimes against humanity are again held accountable for what happened. Now, to understand the real impact of this lawsuit, to pull back from 10,000 feet, if you will, and really get down to ground level, I'm so grateful that one of the plaintiffs, Nahar Neda, has agreed to share his story publicly with all of you. Now, unfortunately, Nahar isn't able to join us live for this webinar today, but he recorded his story just a few days ago for us. And I am glad, I am honored, I'm humbled that we have the opportunity to play it here for you so you can hear directly from Nahar about the experience of his family and why he's participating in this groundbreaking suit. Sasha, let's cue that up.
Thank you for having me and allowing me, giving me the chance to tell our story. Really appreciate it. So Be'eri, the kibbutz where I grew up, is now a big, flourishing, successful community, or let's say was before October 6th, October 7th. and will be again in the coming future. But Kibbutz Be'eri was a very successful, flourishing community. A bit over 1,200 people overall in the kibbutz. The main source of income is a big printing house that basically prints everything that exists in Israel, and that allowed the kibbutz to really be as financially successful as it is. For me, growing up in the kibbutz, I think probably like it is for almost every child, it's a paradise for children, right? There's very little cars around, so you're very free to roam around, to do whatever you want. I was very connected to the agriculture side of the kibbutz, so I was always more in the field than I was at school, driving tractors since I was a little kid. And I think it was that way for a lot of my friends as well. It was a really perfect place to grow up in. So my mom, Adrian, she was born and raised in California. Her dad was an Air Force engineer, so skipping between Navy bases for most of her childhood, but mostly in California. And then early 80s, she met my dad, and didn't take a long time for her to do Aliyah and actually go to live with him in Be'eri, in the kibbutz, right? So this is what, 81 or just at the end of 1980 when she made Aliyah. And yeah, they lived in the kibbutz. They built a family. It's me and 3 other siblings. My mom, back in California, she was a musician. She was already playing in an orchestra, but moving over to Israel and doing all that change, she also made a career path change and became a nurse back in Israel. So she was the nurse for the community for a really long time. Like 10 years, she took care of everybody in Be'eri, and then decided that she wanted to take an extra step and develop the career into a midwife. So she was a nurse and a midwife. And being a midwife, that meant transitioning to the regional hospital in Soroka in Be'er Sheva, where she delivered a lot of babies, right? From all the religions, all the races, everybody that's in the Negev, so Bedouins, a lot of Jewish people, obviously, some people even coming from Gaza or from Hebron, like with a little bit of complications on the medical side would come in. So yeah, she saw and took care of everybody. And after the tragedy of October 7th, we had a lot of stories from people that she took care of them in that time of having a baby, which is such an important time in people's life. So we got a lot of stories from all over the country about my mom from the hospital. In the kibbutz, yeah, other than being the community nurse, that means being really intimate with a lot of members of the community. When she transitioned into a midwife, sometimes when certain women were not able to get to the delivery room, then she actually delivered a few babies in the kibbutz, right? Like as an emergency procedure, but that happened as well. And that also some of the stories that we heard about how my mom kind of stepped into a difficult situation and really saved the situation and helped the lady and the baby. So yeah, we had a lot of those stories. I think that's kind of how I like to think about my mom generally in life, but also her position, her role in the community as a caregiver, as somebody that helped a lot of other people, women in need, but not only. So that's kind of how we see it and the stories that we heard after the tragedy of October 7th. I was at my house in California. I've been living in California for the last 4 years. And like a lot of those events started like, I don't want to say normal because it's not normal, right? But routine would be the word, where there's missile attacks and alarms going off in the kibbutz and the surrounding communities. And every time we had such an attack, I would give my dad and my mom a call just to make sure that they're safe and that they're in the safe room, in the shelter, and everything is routine. So as soon as I heard that, and this is like 6:30 a.m. back in Israel, right, when things were just starting to roll out. I got a message that there was another alarm going on in the kibbutz. So I gave my dad a call. He was traveling up north, so he wasn't around. He wasn't in any danger. And I gave my mom a call, and she said, "Yeah, there's some missiles. I'm going into the safe room." At that point, early on, everything seemed routine. Like it's not a good experience, but we've been through this. At some point, quite early on, like maybe half an hour into the into the day, we understood that this wasn't like your normal missile attack, and that something different is going on. My mom, she began reporting that she's been hearing a lot of gunshots outside of the house and some shouting in Arabic. And that's at that point I got my other siblings on the line, and we are all on a conference call with her through all of those hours. So yeah, basically just staying on the phone with her, trying to make her feel safe and making sure that she's in the safe room and keeping herself safe. And honestly, it all seems kind of it seemed okay for a while, right? For about 2 hours, we're on the phone with her, and it seemed like nothing was happening. She did continue to report on the shooting and shouting outside, but we felt like she was in her house, locked in the safe room, and she's gonna be all right. At that point, I dropped off the conversation for about 5 minutes, and this was like 10:30 a.m., something like that, and maybe a little bit earlier. And after really 5 minutes where I wasn't on the call and my two other siblings were on the call with her, my brother gave me a call and said that him and my sister were on the line with her when they heard the terrorists barge into the house, and there was a little bit of shouting going on between my mom and them. She knew a little bit of Arabic from the delivery room because she helped a lot of Bedouin women. I don't know if that helped her a lot with that conversation with terrorists, right? But she did try to talk to them a little bit, and then the call ended. So that was again around 10:30 a.m. Israel time on Saturday morning, and yeah, that's the last that we heard from her, and the last bit of information that we had basically from that morning. I was at my house in California, and the morning after I flew over. But yeah, that was October 7th morning for us, right? After it was all aftermath. After the call ended, we were trying to kind of gather information, but that was the events of that morning with my mom, obviously. So we did spend a few days, let's say until Wednesday night. We're under the assumption, because there was no shooting going on, and there were a lot of abductees, right? People that were abducted from Be'eri. We were under the assumption that she was taken to Gaza with some of the other community members from Be'eri, and we acted under that assumption, right? So we did a lot of media activity and whatever we could to find out what was going on, and also to act to bring to the release of the hostages. And then Wednesday night, we got the notification, the confirmation from the Israeli authorities that she was identified dead. We gave a DNA sample, so it was like a certain identification. So that wasn't Wednesday night. We got that call, obviously devastating. that my mom was confirmed dead and murdered in Be'eri. The first couple of days were terrible, with the thought that she was held in Gaza, and then the next days or the next time since we learned that she was dead was horrible in a different way, right? Just to learn that she was murdered. So that was what followed, basically. Then I guess the way that like the best scenario for us was to go through the criminal path, legal path, and try to bring the terrorists to justice, and not go through the civilian process. We understand that it is very not probable that anyone can bring this terrorist, like the person that actually committed that murder, bring that person to justice, or the people that sent him, right? We're talking about a ruthless terror organization that's victimizing their own population back in Gaza, and not only us, the Jewish people of Israel. So with that understanding, that bringing those people to court and having them pay for what they did is almost impossible. I think that the next possible process or choice that we have is join this civilian lawsuit that may not really bring those people to justice, but at least have some kind of justice made, right? Like what's the option? Just sit back and take it as it is. I feel like that we have to do something about it and act in whatever possible way that we can. And I think that this is what we can do at the moment, right? I mean, obviously the IDF is engaging in warfare back in Gaza Strip and trying to release the hostages, and also taking a toll from Hamas and trying to dissolve their military capabilities. But for us as a family, we wanted to do something about it, right? Not just sit back and take things how they were. And we felt like this is a good opportunity for us to take action and try to have some kind of justice for my mom and for other victims of this terrible tragedy of October 7th.
Please welcome to the call, Rachel Greenspan.
Thank you so much, Nahar. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for sharing your family's story. And thank you for joining the case. It's all the more important to hear from your powerful words to underscore just how important this case really is. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rachel Greenspan, and I serve as ADL's Associate General Counsel. I'm grateful today to be joining my colleague, ADL Senior Director of National Litigation, James Pash, and also to be joined today by Aryeh Portnoy, a partner at the law firm of Crowell and Mourning, for a chance to dive deeper into this lawsuit. James and Aryeh, thank you for making the time to be with us today.
Thank you, Rachel.
So, James, I'd like to start with you as we dig deeper into this and have a bit of a conversation. Maybe you can explain to our audience why this case is so significant and why ADL is co-counsel in the matter.
Rachel, I think that as far as the case's significance, it's hard to listen to Nahar, who we just heard from, and not just kind of understand the gravity and the weight of the significance of this case by just listening to Nahar's story and the story of his family. And when we talk about the significance of the case, I think part number one is for the families that we represent, the 130 individuals now, to be able to tell their stories to the world, right? What one of the things that made the aftermath of the October 7th attack so unique was that October 7th denialism began minutes after the attack and within days spread across the globe, right? And this lawsuit gives a real opportunity to show who was responsible for the attack, who helped provide material support to allow it to occur, and to hear the stories of the victims of the attack, and to cement what occurred both currently and for all of history. And so there's a real significance to that extends past what we also hope to do, which is bring some recompense and justice to the families, right? As far as ADL's involvement in the case goes, right, we are the world's leading anti-hate organization that fights anti-Semitism. And we are talking about the most deadly, most horrific anti-Semitic attack that has occurred since the Holocaust. So for us, it was, how do we use every tool in our toolkit in responding to that attack? And that is why we've partnered with REA and his team at Kroll, and why we're bringing this case forward on behalf of the U.S. victims and families of U.S. victims of this horrific attack.
Thanks, James. I think that's really important context as we kind of frame out this conversation about the importance of the lawsuit. I want to turn to you now, REA, and ask about the legal framework of this case. How is a firm or the firm NADL, how are we able to file this type of a case against these three countries?
Thanks, Rachel, and thank you for having me. So I'll give a very brief history lesson on these cases that I'll kind of lay it out. Try to avoid lawyer speak. There have been terrorist attacks going on for a very long time, ramping up in the early 80s and going forward. There really was no method for victims of these attacks to do anything. American victims couldn't bring a case in court. You're not going to bring a case against the actual terrorists. They're usually gone, or there's no real ability to have a meaningful case against them. And you couldn't sue the countries because they had immunity in the courts. And so what happened was, in the mid-1990s, Congress passed a law that created an exception to immunity for terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism. And it's a limited exception, and it's limited to countries that are on the U.S. State Department's list of designated state sponsors of terrorism, which currently include 4 countries. They are Syria, Iran, North Korea, and Cuba. And that law created the opportunity to bring cases like this. And you don't need to show that Iranian terrorists came across the fence. Okay, this recognized that that there are people and countries behind these attacks. So that's why there is this material support standard. And so Congress created this opportunity to bring cases for victims, to bring cases against the countries that commit or provide material support or resources for a terrorist attack. And I'll say that since that time, there have been probably hundreds of cases brought over the past 3 decades, holding countries like the defendants in this case liable to the victims of the attacks for the horrors that they've caused.
And if this case is successful, how are the victims able to receive the compensation that you just mentioned?
So there are different ways that a plaintiff could recover. The most likely method of recovery is what's called the U.S. Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund. I suspect we'll probably get a little more in details on this in a bit. That is the way that most victims have been able to obtain some meaningful compensation in these cases. Also, if you are successful in a case like this, you hold a judgment from a federal U.S. District Court. And so with that judgment, you could go and pursue assets of the defendants, if you can find them. That is a process that is likely to take many years and go through numerous legal hurdles, but that is an available option if assets can be located. And that's always part of the toolbox that is being used to try to help the families. And another thing that has happened in certain instances, there have been a couple of other countries that have been on the list over the years. For example, Libya and Sudan were previously on the list. Those countries decided at some point in time they didn't want to be on that list anymore. And those countries entered into agreements with the United States to get themselves off the list. And as part of those agreements, they had to take care of, in some way, these judgments that were held against them. So there have been victims from other countries that have been able to obtain compensation through those government-to-government settlements. But for this case, for the moment, the most direct, the quickest and most direct path to some meaningful relief is going to be the U.S. Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund.
So this fund that you've just kind of laid out, maybe some people might not know really the extent of it. How was it funded, and why did it come to fruition in the first place?
Sure. So this fund was, let me take a half a step back. So it was in the mid-90s that Congress created this opportunity for people to bring these cases. And people brought these cases, and they succeeded in these cases, and they achieved one of the main purposes of these cases that James talked about, which is having their voices heard and having a court validate and hold accountable what their story is and hold accountable those who are responsible for what happened to them. But they held a piece of paper, and they were not able to do anything with it. And so in 2015, as a result of significant lobbying efforts, Congress created the U.S. Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund on a bipartisan basis. This was created because Congress recognized that it had created a right without a remedy, ultimately, or an accessible remedy. The funding for this fund it's important to note, this is not tax dollars. So there isn't always money in the fund. Where the money comes from is from fines and penalties and forfeitures from cases against companies or individuals who do business with state sponsors of terrorism and thereby violate sanctions laws. So it also serves as a deterrence effect as well. If you as a company engage in business with Iran or with Syria or with one of these countries, and you get caught and you get prosecuted, or you make an agreement, a plea agreement with the government, and you pay some significant amounts of money, could be in the hundreds of millions of dollars, some portion of that money goes into this fund, which is then distributed out to all of the victims in the fund. If I may, I'll mention there is a challenge that's part of the effort that we're engaged in now with this fund. It has not recently functioned in the way it has been intended. The funds have dried up in that fund, prosecutions have slowed, and more significantly, funds from cases that Congress intended to go into the fund are not going into the fund. And it is for that reason, and this was mentioned in the press release that ADL put out, is for that reason that Representatives Lawler and Gottheimer, along with Representatives Malliotakis and Goldman and others, have introduced legislation to ensure that these victims, that the American victims of state sponsors of terrorism, receive the funds that Congress promised them, because the whole purpose of this fund was to ensure consistent and meaningful compensation to victims who obtain these judgments. And so in addition to the work that we're going to have to do to bring this case and hold these countries accountable and responsible, it is going to be imperative for Congress to step in and fulfill its promise to the victims when these victims join those that are already in the fund.
Thank you. So when you kind of zoom out now that we're thinking about the process of an actual lawsuit, now that the case has been filed as the first step in a multi-step process, what does this look like next steps in terms of, where does this case go?
So the short version is the first thing that has to happen is we have to serve the complaint. We have to get the complaint that we filed to the defendants. And because these countries, not surprisingly, do not respect the US court system, they don't participate in the litigation. That process is complicated and it takes several months. It has to go through diplomatic channels. And so that first step actually takes some time. Now, unlike a typical, just getting into what the next phase is, unlike a typical case where a defendant doesn't show up, you don't just win in a case like this. Even though the Congress has allowed for cases to go forward and has stripped immunity from state sponsors of terrorism, there is still a recognition and a sensitivity to the fact that these are foreign states. And there's, you know, not to get into the weeds of this, there's a concern of what happens, you know, if the US doesn't act a certain way, what happens when the US is sued in some other jurisdiction? So there is a lot of care put into this. And for that reason, even though these countries typically do not show up, the plaintiffs are still held to a standard of proof and have to prove their case. The judge will hold us accountable to deliver that evidence and to make the case. And so the first phase of the case itself, after service, it'll be two halves, is the liability phase. And we will put on expert testimony. We will, we've already obviously done a lot of research. We take these cases very seriously. We do not sue people without doing our research in the first place, but we will put forward the evidence as we would in any case for the court to ultimately analyze and decide which, we presume all of these defendants are responsible. That's the liability phase. After the liability phase, we then go to the damages phase, and that's when we have the opportunity to present the stories of each and every one of the victims, the plaintiffs in this case, the victims and the family members who are also plaintiffs in the case, and we'll put that forward. That process, it's impossible to predict a time frame. It depends on the judge, it depends on a lot of things, but I think a good estimate of that is about 1.5 years to get to a judgment. It can be a little more, it can be a little less, but I think based on our experience over the years, that's a reasonable estimate, as long as you don't hold me to it, because there are a lot of things that we can't predict.
Sure. We certainly know that sometimes lawsuits do take quite a bit of time to resolve itself and ultimately achieve the goals that we hope for it to achieve. So I appreciate you laying that out for everybody. James, I want to turn back over to you, kind of give you the last word as we wrap up this portion of our webinar. What are you all, and by you all, I mean both ADL and Carl and Maureen, like, what is everyone hoping to achieve with this lawsuit?
Rachel, you know, I think it's a broad term, but right, ultimately at the end of the day, we're hoping to achieve justice, right? Justice on behalf of the victims, justice on behalf of nation states being held accountable for supporting one of the most horrific terrorist attacks that we have seen in modern times, right? We must set the record straight. We have an obligation to set the record straight to the world, and most importantly, to each of the individuals that we collectively represent, right? Justice must be done. And that is the core of why we are involved in this case. I know it's the core of why Kroll is involved in this case and REA, and we will not rest until that occurs.
Thank you, James. Thank you, REA. We really appreciate both of you sharing these insights about this important lawsuit. At this time, I'm pleased to welcome and turn the program over to ADL Vice President of Leadership, Deb Leipzig, to moderate our audience Q&A.
Thank you, Rachel. As a reminder, if you're joining us today from a computer, there is a chat option at the bottom of your Zoom program where you can ask your question in the chat, or you can also email your question to onlineevents@adl.org. And my favorite part of the call, which is where I get to answer the one question I know the answer to, which is yes, this call is being recorded and will be shared via email and on ADL's YouTube channel after we finish. So you'll be able to access it and send it to all of your friends. All right. Thank you, James and Aryeh. Let us jump in. We're seeing a lot of things in the chat right now. I'm seeing lots of things around the other headlines we've been seeing around other cases that have to do with 10-7. So James, why don't I turn to you? Can you speak a little bit to how this case is different from the other filings that we've been seeing?
That's a great question, Deb. And I'll start by saying we support all the efforts that are going on collectively in the ether to hold people to account for their actions and to actively represent victims of the attack, right? But this case is unique in the sense that you could only bring a case under this law against terror-supporting nation states that are on the state-sponsored terrorism lists, and we believe that it is the quickest path forward to provide recompense and justice to the victims, and the quickest path forward for them to be able to tell their stories in a federal district court, right? So that's why we're pursuing this route. With that being said, the route that some others are pursuing is something we should all keep our eye on and also collectively support.
Thank you for that, James. Aryeh, I'm going to direct this to you. How does a plaintiff qualify for this type of case? Do you have to be a U.S. citizen? Is that the piece?
It's access to the U.S. courts, and so for these cases under this law, a plaintiff must be. I'm going to answer this. It's a little complicated. I'm going to answer it quickly. So the law basically says that either the victim or the claimant must be an American citizen, a member of the U.S. military, or an employee of the U.S. government. We're talking about American citizens here. And so the short answer to the question is the following. Any American citizen, which can be a joint citizen, joint Israeli-American citizen, but any American citizen who was injured, which can be emotionally or physically injured, obviously killed, can be a plaintiff in this case, as can all of that individual's immediate family members, whether they are American or not, because they have suffered themselves on account of their American citizen loved one suffering in a terrorist attack. The more exceptional circumstance is where a direct victim is not American, okay, but has immediate family members who are. In that kind of unique situation, the actual direct victim does not have the ability to bring the case because they are not American, but the American family member can, because they suffered their own individual injury. In the case, the way I usually describe it is their loved one, let's say they survived, the October 6th version of their loved one does no longer exist. They have suffered that loss. And obviously, if they, God forbid, passed away or were murdered, I should say, they were killed, then that American family member has the ability to bring a case as well. There does need to be an American hook for this particular law, in this case, in a U.S. court.
Lots of questions in the chat around proof and evidence. So can either of you speak a little bit to how do you gather the evidence for this? Who does it get presented to? And are these countries that are being that we're specifically suing, how do we prove that they have provided that material support in this specific time?
You want me to jump in on that?
Sure, if you want to start, and then I could always follow up.
Sure. I'll say this, Deb, is that the courts have recognized that and you'll see in the decisions, the courts recognize that it's not always easy to prove accountability for a terrorist attack, because although sometimes it is the case, it is often the case that they won't just raise their hand and say, yes, I did it. Okay. And you have seen that in this particular case. So the courts are mindful of that. What it is our responsibility to do is to provide as much evidence as we can in what form we can provide it. That will take the form of, there's a lot of facts on the ground that have been, you can read them in the news accounts, but there are sources for all of that. We have to go and dive in, identify those sources, find the information, present it as evidence. These cases frequently have multiple experts who will talk about the geopolitical history of material support that essentially demonstrates that the act could not have been committed without the material support that has been provided for years and years and years. And so it will be a combination of potentially, fact witnesses, which could be governmental witnesses, could be witnesses, frankly, on the ground, talking about whether you're talking about the types of weapons that I've seen and identifying the source of those weapons or the like. And there will be a lot of expert testimony as well that's there. Ultimately, the court will have questions. We'll pose them, and we'll have to answer them through that evidence.
All right. So a bunch of questions about this as well. And James, I think this is probably for you. You'll let me know. Why wasn't Qatar, a major funder of Hamas, not named as a party in this suit? And what about UNRWA? Like, why was that named? And maybe why aren't we suing Hamas directly?
Yeah. All great questions, Deb. As far as other nation states under the law that we're suing under, which REA laid out the specific law earlier in this webinar, you have to be on the U.S. state-sponsored of terrorism list. There's only 4 nations on that list currently, right? Iran, Syria, North Korea, and Cuba, right? So Qatar is not on that list, and therefore under this law, they cannot be sued. Right? And so that answers that part of the question. As far as why didn't we go after other orgs such as UNRWA, etc., I think, as I said earlier, right, we certainly support some of those other cases that are in the ether. I think there are differences in an ability to quickly bring about a resolution in those other suits that results in victims getting compensation in a relatively quick manner. And I don't think that exists in the situation of UNRWA. As far as Hamas directly goes, very difficult to right, they're not a recognized entity with funding that we could go after in United States courts, and it's very difficult to see how we would get funding into the hands of the victims and our clients in this case. Whereas there are actual nation states that clearly provided material support that but for their long-standing support would have been almost impossible for Hamas to create an attack of the magnitude that they carried out on October the 7th. And holding those nation states to account for that is vital. And the ability to get compensation to our clients is equally as vital.
Thank you. So lots of questions about, but what can I do? What can we do? And how can we support this? So how can those on the call today help support the efforts to ensure the U.S. Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund continues to be available for future victims of terror attacks? James, is that you? REA, please.
REA, you want to start and I can hop in, that's fine.
Sure. It's a great question. I like the question because it's helpful to have the support. I mean, ultimately, this is going to require legislative action. I can tell you, I've never walked into an office on Capitol Hill where somebody looked at me and said, "Boy, that's a bad idea." But unfortunately, things can move slowly on Capitol Hill, and things can and different priorities can come up. It is really important that our representatives understand the importance of this to the Jewish community, to the victims that are the next group of victims that are going to come into this fund. Because at the end of the day, it's going to be up to our elected representatives to vote on whether to sponsor and support and make this bill into law that is going to help address the challenges that the fund has faced. This fund can and should work in the way it was intended, which is not paying everybody out immediately. Everyone understands that. It's over time, but it can and will work if it is administered the way it should be. And this legislation that Representatives Lawler and Gottheimer are leading and put forward really can help. And so if people have relationships up on the Hill, as much pressure and force as can be pushed forward up on Capitol Hill would obviously go a long way in helping us get where we need to get.
Yeah, Deb, I just add to that.
Please.
No, nothing is ever going to undo the pain that October 7th caused to our clients and to all the victims of the attack. But there must be some semblance of justice, and one of the ways to do that is through financial compensation. Right. So I would urge everyone listening today to contact their members of Congress to ask that they co-sponsor and support swift passage of the bill that REA talked about. And I know we're going to be sharing an ADL action item here in the chat that directs people to do just that, either through text message or through phone calls. It's important that your local your representatives hear from you. Right? They listen to you. They need to know from your mouths that this is an important issue for their constituents. And it should be an important issue for all of us. So thank you, Deb.
Thank you. So does Israel have to worry about these kinds of lawsuits being filed by Gaza civilians? What are your thoughts? REA?
Well, they don't because Israel is not a designated state sponsor. Well, forget whether it's designated or not. It's not a state sponsor of terrorism, but it's also not a designated state sponsor of terrorism. And these cases are limited to that. So there is no opportunity to bring a case like that in the U.S. courts. Immunity would exist just as it would for Qatar, which is not on the list. Immunity would exist and would prevent a case like that being brought.
All right. Thank you for that. James, this one's going to go over to you. Can you talk a little bit about how this case and how our being a part of it, why this case was prioritized in terms of ADL resources and over other ADL objectives? Why was this important and core to ADL's mission?
Deb, we've grown our national litigation efforts, our proactive litigation efforts over the last year and a half to respond to the immense growth of anti-Semitism that we have seen across the globe, right? Filing lawsuits against extremist entities, right? And we're talking about one of the single largest acts of extremism and anti-Semitism that we've ever seen, right? And if we are the leading organization in the fight against extremism and anti-Semitism, it is incumbent on us to fight back with as much force and as much ferocity as we possibly can. And one of the best tools to do that is to use the courts. Right? The courts have long been the backbone of securing rights, securing justice, and in the fight against hate and in the fight against extremism, it is crucial that we once again harness the power of the courts to help speak truth to power.
Thank you for that. Seeing lots of other questions about what happens when there's resolution, but the biggest question seems to be around timeline. This does not feel like something that's going to be resolved next week or next month, or I don't know, maybe next year. Can you speak a little bit to what the timeline moving forward looks like?
As I said, to get to a judgment in the case is probably going to take about a year and a half. It could be a little more, it could be a little less, but that's to get the piece of paper. As James mentioned, look, at the end of the day, nothing's going to make things right here, but the help that this case can provide, that compensation, that's going to take time. And a lot of the answer to your question, Deb, is going to depend on us getting this legislation passed, because right now that fund is moving very slowly, and it should move faster than that. I will say that the fund is currently slated to exist until the year 2039, because there's a recognition that this is a kind of overtime process. But our hope is that, if we get a judgment in a year and a half, that compensation will begin for families, help them to use those resources just to do something to make their lives a little bit better. in the year after they get those judgments, and then annually thereafter. That is the idea. And so once you get the judgment, then now you're in the fund, and then hopefully it is something that is kind of a repeat action that gives at least something year over year that is going to help people's lives be made a little bit better. I can't tell you how long it'll take to be paid in full, or if it will be paid in full, but that's kind of that's the timeline of how this is going to progress.
Thank you for that. James, has ADL ever done anything like this before at this scale?
Yeah, in many ways, a case like this is in ADL's DNA, right? We were on the front lines in fighting the white Aryan resistance. We were fighting terrorism with and on behalf of the Klinghofers, who were a large part in making cases like this possible. We've been on the front lines of fighting extremism, most recently in cases on the far right against the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers for their actions. And so it makes sense that we would enter this case to fight extremism and to fight anti-Semitism wherever and whenever it exists.
Thank you for that, James. I think that's a really a true statement there. Okay. Also from the chat, is there an expectation in these cases that certain victims are denied compensation, perhaps while others are not, or others receive?
I mean, I think, look, it's the sad truth that showing harm in this kind of a case, what could be more obvious than that? I can't predict what a court is going to do. I can speak from experience in these cases. I don't have any reason to expect or believe that anyone is going to be treated differently. Courts know how to deal with these cases. I think I'm not supposed to be paying attention to the chat, but they do pop up. So I'll actually answer another question as I'm doing it. This case will be brought in federal district court in DC. And these judges are used to these cases, and they know how to deal with the compensation and the judgments. I have no reason to believe that people will be treated differently. They will be treated like others who are in similar situations to them.
Thank you for that, and thank you for tracking the chat. That was my next question. Unfortunately, we are about out of time. I do want to thank Jonathan for being on at the top of the call, James, Aryeh, of course, Nahar for that fantastic statement. It was really quite moving to hear his story so personally, and Rachel for doing such a nice job moderating that panel. Thank you so much for being a part of our webinar today. If you want to learn more about this groundbreaking lawsuit, you can join us later today for an Instagram Live at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 1:30 p.m. Pacific, with Iranian influencer Mandana Dayani. And later this week, there will be an episode of Dan Senor's podcast, Call Me Back, focused on this case, and that'll come out later this week. I think we put it in the chat already, but let's do it one more time. Before you go, we hope that you will take a moment to support the plaintiffs. As we discussed today, unfortunately, the American Jewish community is no stranger to state-sponsored terrorism, a point painfully and acutely drilled home on October 7th. While nothing will ever undo the unbearable pain that Hamas caused, there must be some sense of justice for their suffering. We urge you to reach out to your member of Congress to ask that they support and co-sponsor the swift passage of the American Victims of Terrorism Compensation Act. That's HR 8419. This bill will ensure that the U.S. Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund has the proper funding to make critical payments to victims and their families for the foreseeable future. Again, this call has been recorded, and you will be receiving that recording along with the call to action in your email, hopefully later today, if not early tomorrow. And we encourage you to share and take that action. And I want to thank you all for taking your time to be with us today. And thank you so much. Be well.